Good morning, class. Today we're going to be looking at American education. Why is it so confusing? Why is it so hard to get it right? Well, to address this question, we first need to take a history lesson back to 1896, where there was a court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. In this court case, there were white people who wanted to segregate train cars so that they didn't have to ride on the same train car as a black person. And so the Supreme Court eventually ruled that this was okay, and thus the phrase separate but equal was born. And so as long as the accommodations for both parties were equal, then separation was okay and segregation was okay. And so for the first half century until 1954, it was okay for education to be separate. So in 1954, there were 5 different cases that were brought to the Supreme Court. Altogether, they became known as Brown versus Board of Education. Now, in Brown versus Board of Education, these 5 defendants, thought that it was unconstitutional to have separate education because the quality of schools was different. Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was in fact unconstitutional, so they overturned their decision from 1896. Fast forward to the next year, and people are wondering how to implement integration into different schools. And so the Supreme Court rules that they're going to use this phrase, integration must be implemented with all deliberate speed. And so this was a very controversial phrase and somewhat intentional phrase. It was very vague, and so basically what it meant is you guys have to start integrating schools, but take your time, and there's no really system of implementation that we are requiring of you guys. One person that this affected immensely was a man named Charles Ogletree. He ended up writing a book called All Deliberate Speed, Reflections of the First Half Century of Brown versus Board of Education. So in this, he reflects on his experiences as a college student at Stanford and Harvard, as a black kid among many whites trying to study and get a degree. He addresses his busing experience in Chicago, and he discusses different figures who played a role in integration and this whole civil rights activism, including Dr. Martin Luther King, and he also addresses the transition between Justice Thurgood Marshall and Justice Clarence Thomas, and he doesn't like Thomas. He thinks Thomas did a lot of damage pertaining to education. And yeah, essentially the whole Ogletree's whole book serves to promote reconsideration of how integration affects American society in education. So how is this seen in Metro Nashville public schools? In 1955, when all deliberate speed was ruled by the Supreme Court, Metro Nashville public schools decided to integrate year by year their system. So it would take 12 years, and they would just start with first graders the incoming year, and they would have that first grade class be an integrated class. That first day of school, there were 0 white people at school and very, very few black people. People just didn't want to integrate, it seemed like. But in 1967, they made a bigger push for it. They started busing so that they would be able to integrate, busing black kids to white schools and white kids to black schools. And white people reacted by starting to institutionalize a bunch of private schools. This was their way of fighting integration. Because they could oftentimes afford it when black people couldn't. So the city of Nashville, and it was common to do this nationwide, they started implementing magnet schools as one way to try to combat to combat segregation and encourage integration. So this all was going pretty well for Nashville. So in 1998, they applied for what's called unitary status. Now, unitary status is basically something granted that means we did what we could, and we've done all that we could, and this is the result. And so let us go back to, or let us, have freedom and not have to focus on integration. So Nashville was granted this, and very soon thereafter, they reverted back to their old ways. It did not take long for them to resegregate at all, and this is still seen today. We visited 2 schools over the course of the semester. One was Pearl Cone High School and one was Hume Fogg High School, and they illustrate how race can affect the quality of a school. While other factors do play into the following statistics, it's undeniable that race does affect these statistics greatly. So Pearl Cone is 94% minority, and 86% of their student body is in poverty. Conversely, Hume Fogg High School is 66% white, and only 19% of their population is in poverty. The average ACT score for Pearl Cone is a 15, and the average ACT score for Hume Fogg is a 27. Again, obviously there are other factors that contribute to these statistics. One of them is socioeconomic class of the student body, but that has a very high correlation with what race you are in this country. And so that's one of the major problems that the system of education faces. So race obviously was and still is one of the biggest controversies in American education history. But even today, there are new debates arising and currently very heated topics that people just simply disagree on. The first of these is gender. People disagree on whether or not schools should be separated by gender, or maybe not schools, but maybe classrooms. Some people think that boys learn better with boys, girls learn better with boys, or girls learn better with girls. Other people think that it's important to grow up in an environment with both genders so that people are more socially adept and stuff like that. A second issue is the national origin of students who have moved to America and currently go to school here. Should they be required, in terms of both language and culture, should they be required to adapt to American education, or is it the responsibility of American education to cater to the students' language needs and culture needs? Another controversial topic is about religion in schools. The Constitution prescribes the separation of church and state, as well as, sorry, there's someone outside. It prescribes the separation of church and state, as well as the freedom of religion. So that also relates to, can students pray in school? Can they wear certain clothing? How much school should they be allowed to miss? And what days off should everyone have? And what days off should just like minority religions have? At what point do all these things become disruptive to the student learning, and should that be regulated? A fourth topic has to do with school choice. Should students be allowed to go to either charter schools or private schools using public funding? Some say yes, because people believe their students shouldn't be confined to the public school where they live. They should be able to go to a private school regardless of how much money they have, or go to a charter school that has a different system of operation. Other people say no, because they think that the money should stay at the public school and not be taken out of that system where other kids go to. The final topic is zoning, and this has to do with whether schools should bus kids in order to diversify different schools. And so basically the clash here comes from whether or not people think the community feel of having a neighborhood school is more important, or the benefits of integration are more important. And this comes from the fact that people just generally live with people in regions with people of a similar race. There are no concrete answers to any of these things. The race issue has been around for so long, and it's still being addressed today. And so these all contribute to why education is so hard to get right. It's different from science in that, like, all doctors of science generally agree on the same thing, whereas doctors of education may have vastly different, differing opinions. There's no one right way to do that, and so that concludes this lesson, class. First lesson as a teacher. Also, I'm a math teacher. This was hard, but also a good experience.